Copyright disclaimer under Section 107 of the Copyright Act 1976. Allowance is made for fair use for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, education, and research.
For many sports fans, the countdown for next season begins immediately following the current one. Now, we're only about a month away from the beginning of the 2022 NFL season, which leads two teams to a head-to-head contest for the top spot, one of the most watched television events, the Super Bowl. Now, I have to admit, as a generally femme-presenting raging homosexual male, I don't really watch for the game. I'm there for the halftime show and the commercials. But I'm not a stereotype. I do like football players. But regardless of the reason, this year I joined in with 112.3 million people in watching the Super Bowl, and the halftime show was monumental. While compared to years prior, the production scale was quite a bit smaller, due in part to COVID protocols, the performance was absolutely epic. You had Dr. Dre, Kendrick Lamar, Eminem, Snoop Dogg, and Mary J. Blige all absolutely delivering, with even 50 Cent to spare. But unfortunately, a good time was not had by all. I mean, it goes without saying that you can't please everyone, but depending on where you live in the United States, the halftime show this year was a little bit more divisive than most, at least to my recollection. That said, it was difficult to find an actual logical deduction as to why those that didn't like it. But we did find a few. Jackie Chapchisk, for example, said, "I personally was appalled. There was no beauty, no grace, and for that matter, no melodious music. Just people jumping up and down, holding their crotches, and yelling words too hard to understand even with subtitles. How disappointing. Can't we do better than this, so that all of us can enjoy a show that represents many diverse acts? You know, because all lives matter." Noel Johnson said, "Music is defined as vocal or instrumental sounds combined in such a way as to produce beauty of form, harmony, and expression of emotion. The hallmarks of Sunday's halftime performances were indecipherable lyrics and non-existent melodies. Composers from George Gershwin to Johnny Mercer to Paul McCartney to Stephen Sondheim probably rolled in their graves." Okay, just because you don't understand the words doesn't mean they were indecipherable. And despite calling the melodies non-existent, they still, wait for it, existed. And Paul McCartney, you know, one of the greats, according to you, who's rolling over in his grave, he's not dead, hon. But in researching these scholars that provided such intellectual analysis, well, it was pretty easy for me to see a pattern, and unfortunately, as a resident of rural Pennsylvania, it's pretty clear to read between the lines, if you're not too daft to read there, that race plays more of a role than these well-spoken comments that you'd find in print would lead you to believe. The truth is, despite the strides we've made as a society in terms of racial equality, we didn't really wash the prejudice off. It just kind of seeped in. I mean, yes, the playing field is more equal for everyone than it once was, but that, unfortunately, doesn't make it equal for everyone. And irony notwithstanding, that's kind of what makes the 2022 halftime show so incredible. Every artist that graced that arena was someone who, for all intents and purposes in the eyes of society, should not have been there. I don't mean that they weren't worthy. I mean, statistically speaking, they shouldn't have made it at all, let alone to one of the biggest stages in the world. I mean, ghettos and trailer parks birthed that performance. Drugs, violence, and illegal activity seasoned their lives to create the unique stories that came together for a show-stopping performance that meant something to a lot of people watching. And this was not supposed to happen. But it did. And it's a beacon of hope for people of color, people of no means, people who life has forgotten or swept aside. Hope that says this could be you. This could be yours. And as we celebrate Black History Month, albeit not in Black History Month, it's my hope that one day it won't take something so epic to convince people that the odds might work out in their favor. One day may the playing field be epically equal, that performances like this aren't anomalies, but the norm in this nation. under God, indivisible, because of the liberty and justice for us all. Hello, my name is Gabe Bryan, and welcome to the Very Intentional Podcast for Very Intentional People, the podcast from Iconic Media Design about being intentional in the life of your business and the business of your life. Now, it's been a hot minute since we've posted an episode, and as you can see, if you've been with us before, things look a little differently. Now, part of the reason for the break that we had was planned for revamping and such, but in no way was intended to last this long, and for that I do apologize. I had taken some time due to some health reasons, nothing COVID, or well, I did get COVID, but it wasn't COVID related initially. I had a bit of a skin issue, and I have an appointment with a dermatologist coming up. What's with the third degree? Gosh, I'm back now, and I'm ready to go. But all of that being said, this episode was pre-recorded. Well, the interview later was pre-recorded because this episode was originally intended to come out during Black History Month. However, given the pulse of our republic and the truth in the title of this episode, it's quite clear that there's still work to be done. So while it's not February, today we are celebrating Black History Month. And since we're already a few months behind, we don't want to waste your time, so actually wait until the end of this episode. And if you didn't get anything out of it, don't subscribe. Mostly because due to the topic today, the odds are high that your reason for not getting anything out of it is probably, well, you know. But if you do get something out of today's episode, take the first step towards becoming a very intentional person by subscribing, which will reward that intention not only with more episodes of this very podcast, but you'll also be privy to additional content, resources, and tools all made available via our YouTube channel. Speaking of our desire to provide you with all that we can in your pursuit of better business, we would love to hear from you. So leave us a comment down below and let us know what you think of the episode, or anything really, or send us an email and request specific topics or resources that would be most beneficial to you specifically. And if you have any questions that you'd like answered, or you just want to hear your voice in an upcoming episode, leave us a voicemail via the Anchor platform, powered by Spotify. You can do it at anchor.fm/VIP for VIP. And don't forget, you can find all of that along with everything referenced in today's episode and every episode, along with a bunch of other goodies in the VIP lounge on our website at www.iconicmedia.design/VIP for VIP. If we can have Christmas in July, then we can celebrate Black History Month in August. For many Americans, that would make your mind go directly to slavery, but as my friend Joe, who you'll meet here in a few moments, says, slavery isn't Black history. It interrupted Black history. And today we're going to be looking at the history following slavery specifically. Now, at Iconic Media Design, we believe that Black history is our history, human history. Unfortunately, we aren't at the finish line yet when it comes to equality in America, and if you don't believe that, can you tell me why a black man at a traffic stop gets pumped full of 60 rounds while a single white man isn't stopped despite 374 officers on site? Yeah, watching the news often makes me reflexively utter the name of our first segment. What in the world? If you're paying attention to what's going on in America right now, and absolutely no offense if you're not, I get it. It's a lot. But in recent times, it's been a trend for lawmakers across the country to bring the inspirational words of Martin Luther King Jr.
You think about what MLK stood for He said he didn't want people judged on the color of their skin, but on the content of their character.
You know, I believe it was Martin Luther King that said, you know, when he was talking about his children, that
he didn't want his children to be judged
on the color of their skin,
but by the content of their character.
Content of their character, not by the color of their skin.
Content of our character, not the color of our skin.
And the immortal words of Dr. Martin Luther King ring in our ears that we must judge others not by the
color of their skin,
but by the content of their character.
The left wants us to constantly focus on skin color. It's destructive. Martin Luther King Jr. is rolling over in his grave.
As I said before, this episode was originally scheduled to air in February because since 1987, February has been Black History Month, a month where we take a specific look at the history of black people in America, particularly like when you were in school. However, in this topsy-turvy world we find ourselves in, where irony isn't shy, instead of celebrating Martin Luther King Jr., the civil rights movement, or honoring the struggle of black people in our nation's history at all, those quoting Dr. King are doing so backhandedly, to remove some of the emphasis put on American black history. And by remove some of the emphasis, I mean completely whitewash.
I am not co-parenting with the government. It is not your job to force these ideas onto my child.
The narrative in this country is that we're all inherently racist, and I'm about sick of it.
It's a Marxist ideology, and we all know it.
All of these lessons have the intent to make our children feel disgust towards our nation.
This country isn't even a racist country. We elected Obama for 2 terms.
Okay, let's be clear for a second. We're not a racist country because we elected Obama twice is like the national scale of the I have a black friend defense. Which isn't a defense at all. And if you do think that we can't possibly be racist because we elected Obama, I've got to ask, where were you when Obama was elected? Because the effect of his election was actually quite the opposite of ending racism. It arguably sparked the resurgence of some very fine people that would later get the green light that their despicable beliefs were valid to spew in the streets from an Oompa Loompa playing president with more than one bigoted bone spur in his body. But I digress. The question some of you are probably thinking is, why are these parents so pissed? But the question that you should be asking is, what does the Fox say?
Critical race theory is being taught in our schools. Critical race theory is bunk.
Critical race theory is a lie. From the first word to the last, from start to finish.
Racist critical race theory.
Critical race theory.
critical race theory in the schools and the wokeness.
Let me tell you right now, critical race theory is bigoted, it is a lie, and it is every bit as racist as the Klansmen in white sheets.
The Western culture and values that brought forth Christianity in the founding documents are being called evil and racist.
Now, these contentious school board meetings from this year are the fruit of a word tree planted last year. In 2021, Fox News said the words critical race theory almost 5,000 times. So there shouldn't be any confusion about what's going on, right? Yet all, and that's not hyperbole, it's a fact, all of the people upset over it can't even define it.
I've never figured out what a critical race theory is, to be totally honest, after a year of talking about it. They're teaching that some races are morally superior to others, that some are inherently sinful and some are inherently saintly, and that's immoral to teach that because it's wrong.
So what is it? Well, first, it's a graduate-level curriculum, which means that it's not happening in public education at all. Anywhere. But here is the best definition that we can find.
Critical race theory just says, let's pay attention to what has happened in this country and how what has happened in this country is continuing to create differential outcomes so we can become that country that we say we are. So critical race theory is not anti-patriotic. In fact, it is more patriotic than those who are opposed to it because we believe in the 13th and the 14th and the 15th Amendment. We believe in the promises of equality, and we know we can't get there if we can't confront and talk honestly about inequality.
Let's go through history. Every race of people has done it as good as Whitey. Latinos, Asians, blacks, every single one has done it. I will say this, Whitey did steal their ideas most of the time and make the most profit of it. And that's critical race theory.
However, thanks to a man named Timothy Rufo, it's been explained a little bit differently.
The President and the White House, it's within their authority and power to immediately issue an executive order abolishing critical race theory trainings from the federal government. And I call on the President to immediately issue this executive order and stamp out this destructive, divisive, pseudoscientific ideology at its root.
We have successfully frozen their brand, critical race theory, into the public conversation and are steadily driving up negative perceptions. The goal is to have the public read something crazy in the newspaper and immediately think critical race theory.
Now let's get this straight. He's not misinformed. He's lying outright to sway public opinion towards school choice, which is this idea that parents should be able to take the tax dollars that are allocated for their student to any school of their choice. And while that doesn't sound inherently racist, the roots of the school choice movement very much are, originating in the South post-Brown versus Board of Education to allow students attendance to what were referred to as segregation academies. And if parents are this upset about something that's not even being taught, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to arrive at the conclusion that those same parents might prefer a school where race isn't referenced at all. And that can only happen not when you don't see color, but when there isn't any to be seen. And despite the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, people of color still have a vastly different experience as Americans than white people. Through gerrymandering, filibustering, and legislating, the voting rights for people of color are currently under attack. Well, I thought they were, but thankfully Mitch McConnell, one of the top Republican lawmakers, was able to debunk that claim and put my mind at ease.
Well, the concern is misplaced because if you look at the statistics, African-American voters are voting in just as high a percentage as Americans.
Can you say Freudian slip? We have triggered a special segment. It's time for Psychology Sidebar. The term psychoanalysis refers to many aspects of the work and research of Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalytic theory. While his ideas were considered shocking at the time and create debate and controversy even now, his work had a profound influence on a number of disciplines, including psychology, sociology, anthropology, literature, and even art. Through his years of case studies and developing personality theories, Freud came to believe that while the unconscious mind is largely inaccessible, the contents can sometimes bubble up unexpectedly, such as in dreams or slips of the tongue. For example, if I were trying to show love for a boyfriend while still in love and mentally attached with an ex-boyfriend, I might accidentally say, "I love you," and insert the ex-boyfriend's name here. But my slip-up actually reveals my true thoughts, and that slip-up is known as a Freudian slip. Remember that the next time your partner calls you the wrong name during sex. And now, we return you to your normally scheduled programming. Now that you know what a Freudian slip is, let's watch that clip of Yertle the Turtle again and see if you can spot it.
Well, the concern is misplaced because if you look at the statistics, African-American voters are voting in just as high a percentage as Americans.
I mean, don't you think that African Americans deserve the same access to voting that we Americans do? Well, don't you? Unfortunately, all citizens having equal and opportune access to voting is not a common desire. And ironically enough, it's the patriot side that is working hard against it, even to the point of outlawing giving people waiting in poll lines something to eat or drink. But it's not super surprising considering they're the same people who claim the Declaration of Independence is propaganda. See, NPR dispensed it in easy-to-digest 140-character servings, and they were hit with 113 consecutive doses of a pill that was, for them, initially hard to swallow. A Twitter user by the name of Darren Mills said, "Seriously, this is the dumbest idea I have ever seen on Twitter." I'll give him the benefit of the doubt here and say this was his first day on Twitter. DG Davies called NPR out on their lack of patriotism, posting, "So NPR is calling for revolution. Interesting way to condone the violence while trying to sound patriotic. Your implications are clear." Are they? Remember, this happened on July 4th, 2017. Mere weeks after the May Day protests over worker and immigrant rights that took place in the United States, escalating to acts of violence in Olympia, Washington, and Portland, Oregon. That's the violence that patriots thought NPR was propagating to validate. And maybe we were ignorant then, but we know now that patriots suddenly stop supporting all lives the moment a bad actor throws a brick through a window. Unless, of course, they're the ones that threw the brick and it's the window of our nation's capital. You know, patriotism. I mean, we watched on January 6th while a riot crowd surrounded and infiltrated the building with minimal shots fired, which seems a bit, not segregated, but still different and unequal to the reaction to the Black Lives Matter protests. How did they put it back then? Oh, we had such an eloquent leader, I don't want to misquote him. Do we have a clip?
When there's looting, people get shot and they die. Well, I've heard that phrase for a long time. I don't know where it came from, where it originated. I view that
in
phrase as...
1967, the Miami police...
Well, I don't know.
chief
I've also
used it.
heard from many other places.
And if there was any doubt of the double standard, it left the building a month after the Twitter situation when neo-Nazis and white supremacists marched through Charlottesville, Virginia with torches and were validated by the leader of the free world as very fine people, which is a bit of a juxtaposition for a guy who claimed to do more for black people than, well...
Nobody has done more for the black community than Donald Trump. And if you look, with the exception of Abraham Lincoln, possible exception, but the exception of Abraham Lincoln, nobody has done what I've done.
You know, like when he took a full page out in the New York Times to call for the death penalty of 5 young black men who had been arrested for raping a white girl. Now, thankfully, they lived. Unfortunately, it was behind bars for 13 years before they were found innocent on appeal, but that didn't stop him from continuing to make ignorant comments since then. But while Trump wasn't hooked on phonics, though he generally breathed like he was hooked on something, he did change the way that we think about words in politics. Not just in the way that he lacked decorum or class, but how he used terminology. And today we're seeing the continuation of this evasive diction and an odd shift happening with the word patriot. It's commonly used as an all-encompassing term for those on the right that want to make America great again. You know, like the Patriots who stormed the Capitol on January 6th. But the torch was passed off from Trump to Fox News when they aired a Tucker Carlson original called Patriot Purge, an expose that pushes the belief that January 6th was a false flag operation perpetrated by the FBI in an effort to lock up Trump supporters. But not just any Trump supporters, patriots. And now that it's not February, we have the hearings of the special committee to investigate January 6th. But while it's proving to be a bit more popular than originally anticipated in terms of conservative appeal, there's still much of the Republican Party that refuses to even entertain the idea of truth. And so they get filled with such garbage as Patriot Purge. But what is it code for? Well, who do you think it might be referring to after a presidency aimed at making America great again and filled with protests for racial justice led to a Democratic president who doesn't put children in cages? My money is on that it's not the America that includes Americans who could be confused with undocumented immigrants, if you catch my drift. See, that's backwards from the America First agenda. See, they use the word patriots as their moniker because they don't really want equality for all Americans. They fully embrace fascism with their worship of an orange wannabe dictator, even when his attempt to end democracy to remain in power meant trying to extort our allies by withholding defense aid. Who was that again? Oh, Ukraine, that's right. But they probably don't need it. But it's not just about slighting our allies. As Joseph McCarthy rolls in his grave, Republicans, well, at least the MAGA billies, show their support for Putin right now. From shirts on the ground that say, "I'd rather be a Russian than a Democrat," that love for Putin has trickled down from the top. You know, like economics.
People came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be. I will tell you that President Putin is extremely strong and powerful. Yesterday, reporters asked me if I thought President Putin was smart. I said, of course he's smart, to which I was greeted with, oh, that's such a terrible thing to say. I'd like to tell the truth. Yes, he's smart. The NATO nations, and indeed the world, they're not so smart. They're looking the opposite of smart. The problem is not that Putin is smart, which of course he's smart, but the real problem is that our leaders are dumb. So Putin is now saying it's independent, a large section of Ukraine. I said, how smart is that? And he's going to go in and be a peacekeeper. That's the strongest peace force. We could use that on our southern border. That's the strongest peace force I've ever seen. There were more army tanks than I've ever seen. They're going to keep peace all right. No, but think of it. Here's a guy who's very savvy. I know him very well, very, very well.
So why do they support Putin? Well, much like we've done with race thus far historically, let's look to snobby rich white guy for the answer. And I know that he didn't know the answer to what critical race theory is, but I think he might have some idea, at least, as to why Putin is so attractive to the right wing in America.
Good evening and welcome to Tucker Carlson Tonight. Since the day that Donald Trump became president, Democrats in Washington have told you have a patriotic duty to hate Vladimir Putin. It's not a suggestion, it's a mandate. Anything less than hatred for Putin is treason. Many Americans have obeyed this directive. They now dutifully hate Vladimir Putin. Maybe you're one of them. Hating Putin has become the central purpose of America's foreign policy. It's the main thing that we talk about. Entire cable channels are now devoted to it. Very soon, that hatred of Vladimir Putin could bring the United States into a conflict in Eastern Europe. Before that happens, it might be worth asking yourself, since it is getting pretty serious, what is this really about? Why do I hate Putin so much? Has Putin ever called me a racist? Has he threatened to get me fired for disagreeing with him? Has he shipped every middle-class job in my town to Russia? Did he manufacture a worldwide pandemic that wrecked my business and kept me indoors for 2 years? Is he teaching my children to embrace racial discrimination? Is he making fentanyl? Is he trying to snuff out Christianity? Does he eat dogs? These are fair questions, and the answer to all of them is no. Vladimir Putin didn't do any of that.
And when I watched that, I couldn't stop myself from uttering, what in the world? It used to be said that sticks and stones may break my bones, but words will never hurt me. However, with furthering our collective intelligence, we've come to realize that sticks and stones will break our bones, but words cause intense psychological trauma that takes years of intentional therapy to heal, a process that many people won't take part in because they believe that it's nonsense or beneath them for some reason, and then they wonder why their lives never change. But I digress. I'm sure we can all recall a memory where somebody said something to us that altered our perception in some way, and what it boils down to is words are important. Now, anyone who knows me knows that I'm a quotes guy, but beyond that, I love etymology, or the study of the history of words. And when it comes to the conversation on race, if we want to improve there, we need to improve our understanding and use of words. For example, I think part of the divide on the belief that there remains today systemic racism comes from not understanding that systemic and systematic aren't the same word. But in an effort to encourage and nurture growth, we've arrived at another new segment. It's time for the Word of the Week. This week's word is equity. Now, when we look at the definition of a word, more often than not, the journey begins with what's referred to as the standard definition, or the one that you would find in Webster's dictionary. But according to Webster, equity means one of two things. Either it's a value of shares issued by a company, or the quality of being fair and impartial. And while these are both helpful in understanding what equity means, it doesn't really help flesh out the concept and help us understand what it means by making it tangible. Well, besides the stock shares, I suppose. I said earlier that this podcast is for the life of your business and the business of your life because life and business tend to overlap quite a bit. You might think that operating your life like a business makes it too rigid and structured, sucking the authenticity of spontaneity from the experience. And to an extent that can be true. Likewise, though, if you were to operate a business with the same carefree, authentic spontaneity that many seek in their lives, it would most likely fail, and pretty quickly. All of that being said, any entrepreneur will tell you that business is personal, almost an extension of oneself, really. And I'm not talking about corporate board members and all of that. While they may have started as entrepreneurs, they certainly aren't really anymore. And if you've ever asked someone something that's a little too personal, you've probably heard them say, "What? That's none of your business." Now, we'll probably get into the nitty-gritty of that analogy in a future episode, but for now, just take my word for it that business and life overlap quite a bit. On that note, when looking for a good definition of equity, I found a more well-rounded explanation from Investopedia. They say equity represents the value that would be returned to a company's shareholders if all the assets were liquidated and all of the company's debts were paid off, so like that remaining balance. Of course, context is key, and we're looking at equity in terms of civil rights and racial justice. Now, as a child who grew up being taught that this incredible country I was lucky enough to be born in was founded on the belief that all men were created equal, and thus all men were endowed with inalienable rights, not limited to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And while I was primed, so to speak, with my experience as a child in reality to not be completely confused by the civil rights movement when we got to that history lesson, I have to say that it was a bit exhausting trying to reconcile it with the equality that seemed so solidly ingrained. I mean, if all men were created equal and we treat everyone equally, then why was there ever a need to fight for rights in the first place? Perhaps that's why so many in America are averse to the idea of thinking about race critically, theoretically. Because in their experience, they were completely present for the beginning of the school year, like that first day, but were absent physically or just mentally the days that covered like day 2 through the 1970s. Okay, I understand that it's extremely low odds of that, but playing devil's advocate, which is it just me or does that term seem extra fitting in this case? Regardless of the reason, there's really no excuse for ignorance on the topic today. But it's not just about the struggle that ever so slowly has become a lighter load over the decades. It's about understanding where things stand in today's society. When I have the opportunity to have a conversation with someone who is honest enough to admit that they don't think that racism exists, or if it does, it isn't to the extreme that it's made out to be, it doesn't take very long to realize that their opinion is based on just their own experience. Which isn't a bad thing necessarily. I mean, it's normal, that's human nature. But it's important to realize that your world is not the world. In a future episode, we're going to look at geographical location and what that means in terms of intelligence and life expectancy. And suffice it to say, you can't apply the opinion of your little bubble to the entire world and act accordingly. In today's data-driven world, it's commonplace to understand that the more we know, the more possibilities there are. But when it comes to topics that make us uncomfortable, we tend to avoid and distract ourselves from learning about the subject in an effort to avoid that discomfort. And not in terms of amount, like greater and lesser than, but in terms of uniqueness, no topic makes white people quite as uncomfortable as race. Historically speaking, and speaking historically. But why is that? We abolished slavery, right? We righted the wrongs, right? In rural Pennsylvania, where I'm from, there's an extremely stubborn aversion to the idea that our system is set up in a way that favors white people. But that being said, and I want to be very clear here, so Trevor, can we zoom in tight here, please? Not believing something doesn't make it not true. Now, I'm not trying to get into every aspect of the system that we all engage with here in America, but if the example that I'm about to give doesn't quite make it click for you, or you want a more full understanding of the concept of systemic oppression, you can check out the VIP Lounge on our website for more helpful links and articles. But since we've been talking about knowledge and learning quite a bit so far, let's use education as our example. Now, education might seem pretty cut and dry equal to you, but consider this. Slavery was abolished in 1865, and while this made black people free in the United States, that's about all it did. Though the passing of the 14th Amendment, which abolished slavery, had invalidated what was referred to as the Black Codes, it wasn't until 1870, that's 5 years later, that black people would be recognized as citizens with rights, including the right to vote. But what happened in the lives of the freed slaves? I mean, slaves were viewed as property, and that property had to be cared for. So they lived on the grounds of the owners, often in a separate building of their own, not possessively, but spaciously. But once the slaves were no longer slaves, they were no longer required to work for nothing, and therefore the once slave owners were no longer obligated to care for them. So what happened? Well, on the slave owner side, I mean, it put a major strain on the economy of the South, losing almost 100% of their workforce in just a few years' time. And as you might assume, there was quite a bit of bitterness on the part of the no longer slave owners. Now, every story of every slave is as unique as they are, so it's impossible to give you a 100% accurate idea of how they went about putting down roots and creating lives of their own in America. But it can be said for sure that prejudice, particularly that in the South, didn't die with slavery. Because of this, black people could often be found all compiled in their own neighborhoods, often called ghettos, or the lowest valued properties were. Now, a rising tide does raise all ships, so to an extent the homes of black people have much improved when compared to then. And of course, the low-income housing across America isn't only made up of black people, and as time has passed, opportunity and chance have serendipitously created anomalies such as Tyler Perry, the man known as Medea, who owns the largest film production studio in the world, located poetically on the land used by the Confederate Army to train soldiers to fight against his very freedom to own anything. Now, I say Tyler Perry is an anomaly because he is. While black people have made major strides, an effect of their own generational determination and grit, in 2022, black men still earn only 87 cents for every dollar that a white man earns. Having struggled with unemployment myself while living in rural Pennsylvania, I can hear the responses now. Well, if you want more money, just go get a better job. And let's just say that's helpful advice and leave it there, huh? But that's only helpful if you can get a better job. Starting at the bottom. Okay, but really, starting at the bottom, education is the most accurate indicator of future success. But here's the thing. Trevor, one more time. Education is funded by property taxes. In case you're having trouble connecting the dots there, the people that live in low-income areas are subjected to an education system that is equally lacking as their homes are. And a lack of education sets people of color up for the SATs. Of course, when I say it sets them up, I mean to fail. But another spoke of the unjust wheel that sustains the vicious cycle of racial systemic oppression. The whole reason we have the SATs was to keep black people segregated after segregation ended. Now, while billionaires are rarely a good indicator of the population, it stands to reason that if education and the opportunities that brings were truly equal, then out of the 724 billionaires in the United States today, more than just 7 of them would be black. And this is where equity comes in. Because when we push for equality, it gave us the world that we live in today, where black people have to actively and consistently remind us that their lives matter due to the unequal experience that they're afforded. But if we want true equality, then we need to provide equity. Here's one way to think about it. Equality gives everyone the same thing. Equity gives everyone what they need. And it's important because it's not about possession, it's about experience. And when an innocent, unarmed black man is murdered by police, while a white teenage boy who murders 2 Black Lives Matter protesters with an illegal firearm is as exalted as a hero, there's a lot that needs to be changed if we want to be great. But again, would imply going back to when we were great. And this is the closest thing we've ever had to equality since we ratified that all men were created equal, which to patriots today isn't America, it's Twitter propaganda. Again, if this example has only whet your palate for more understanding, you can find more articles and links to resources regarding the systemic issues we face in America still today, along with proposals for ways to fix them, which is where the word reparations comes up. Unfortunately, we only have time for one word of the week, but there's a bunch of information on that as well, all at the VIP Lounge on the Iconic Media Design website at www.iconicmedia.design/VIP for VIP. Now, when it comes to continuing effort for civil rights and racial equity in America, one thing I've been more conscious of is that I, as a white male, not straight, thank the Lord, but that I've tried to be more conscious of my voice. And in terms of continuing the fight towards equity for all, that I use what platform I have, but also that I don't speak over the voices of color that I march alongside in that pursuit. Too long and too often have the words of white men and women been ignorant, dismissive, dismissively ignorant, and ignorantly dismissive of people of color, even when we've tried to help. As part of the LGBTQIA+ community, I've learned, however, that no one can give us privilege simply by exercising theirs. In the same way, there are just some things that we as allies of the Black and brown community can't do when it comes to moving the needle forward. In those moments, I'm reminded of our innate human desire not to be fixed, but have companionship and support and love as we fix ourselves. So in the moments when I readily accept my failure to have what's necessary to inspire, motivate, equip, or empower, I find solace in my ability to lift up and direct those in my life towards others, and I've been blessed to be inspired, motivated, equipped, and empowered by myself. To that end, there is one man who, in my short 30 years on this earth, stands out, not just in terms of helping to shatter some of the black and white thinking I had resorted to, often out of ease, and challenge me to find strength in simplicity, showing me the beauty in the broken down and the hope that rises from it like a phoenix. A nationally touring artist, activist, and now published author that I came to meet on a 2014 tour around the exterior United States, an experience that bonds like brotherhood. From Mama Davis's mac and cheese and jerk chicken to words of wisdom shared in times of tension to sharing the stage night after night, it was a privilege to experience his exuding spirit, and a friendship was forged that hasn't only made me a better person, but has inspired me to want to make a better world, regardless of what gets me down or causes me to be cynical about the future. As the director of the multimedia company The New Renaissance, he's able to properly execute his vision of education through art in both sound, solo and alongside his emerging soul-funk conglomerate, The Poetic Diaspora, and through movement as the co-creator of Just Move, a group that seeks racial justice through art. His most recent project, published by Sparkhouse, We Rise Higher, Poems and Prayers for Graduates, equal parts love letter and call to action, has reached number 22 in the world in Amazon Poetry's for Teens and Young Adults section. And that was only 22 days in. Online reviews of the project and offline reviews of the man all share common praise for deeper connections and insightful perspectives, both of which I'm humbled to present to you now in a conversation with a friend, artist, activist, and now author that I'm truly honored and privileged to introduce, Joe Davis. So yeah, well, thank you for speaking to me again, even though the world will never see the last conversation.
The world will never know.
But there's been some development since the last time we talked, which was shortly after the George Floyd murder had happened. But also since then, I've read your book a couple more times over and have found some interesting connection that I kind of wanted to talk to you about, in addition to just some of the recent events happening in the United States, and I guess like the national discourse and how we're moving collectively. So for those who may be just hearing, your book is called We Rise Higher. It's a book of poems and prayers for graduates. And I guess the first thing that I want to start with, and we can get into where you came with the title and whatnot, but I guess in a general sense, the first question is just how? How do we do that? Because I think for a lot of people, especially, like I said, with recent events happening, it seems like a lot of the, I don't want to say the morality, but kind of the moral beliefs that we've thought the country stood for are no longer holding us up.
Yeah, there's a need for perhaps a more secure and stable foundation. And I feel that for me, and in my experience, I always tell folks, I'm not an authority or expert on anything other than my lived experience. So like, I think everyone's an expert of their own experience. So I can just speak to my experience, and I know that I can show up as my like fullest and authentic self when I feel centered and grounded, and I have like deep roots and a strong foundation and like who I am and like my purpose. All those sorts of things like help me show up in a way where I feel like, okay, I got this. Like life is good. I don't know, whatever's gonna happen, whatever life may throw at me, I can persevere. So I have to have things in my life where I feel like, okay, I'm feeling centered, grounded, and connected, right? And so there's a lot of things that can throw us off that, like you said, that have happened, especially over the course of the last like 2-3 years in our country.
Yeah.
Right, to kind of shake our foundation. But I think that if we have some sort of foundational practices, that'll help us. I when I talk about roots, and in the context of we rise higher, I like to say we can only rise as high as our roots run deep. You know,
I like
so
that.
if we have those deep roots, those practices that help us, stay centered, grounded, and connected, then we can show up, we can stretch beyond where we are. And so, yeah, for me, not to, I don't want to sound like ambiguous, like, okay, we got to find these foundational practices, like, I mean, we were talking earlier about meditation, mindfulness, embodiment, like those sorts of things have been really helpful for me. Like finding ways to like focus my mind and my body and like not get distracted, not get sucked into the trauma vortex or like the chaos that's going on around me. Because I think that there can be a quietness and a stillness inside of me that I've been able to tap into. It's really beautiful. And I have to go back to that place again and again and again. And like meditation helps me get to that place. Reading and music and dance. And I talk about embodiment because it always helps me to move my body in some way. And I know different people have different ways of moving their body. Like some people don't have as much mobility as others, but as long as you can like stay connected to your body and listen to your breath, listen to your body. Because when I was younger, I feel like I may have shared this with you before, but when I was younger, a lot of times it didn't feel safe to be in my body, it was for a number of reasons. I was a really sick kid in and out of the hospital all the time. And just growing up in the United States with this skin, right? There was a lot of discriminatory actions that happened with my family and with myself. And so like my body didn't always feel safe. So I think I had a maladaptive coping mechanism of like being able to escape my body, through imagination, through writing, and it was really playful. And now that I'm older, I look at those behavioral patterns and I kind of reclaim them and use them in ways that are healthier, but also finding new ways of coping with, the crazy things that are happening in my life and the crazy things that are happening in the world. And those new ways really involve me like sinking into my body and staying in my body and reminding myself that everything that my body has ever done has been to protect me and keep me safe and keep me alive. Like, even if sometimes it's decontextualized and it might not be as helpful, whatever my body does, it's trying to keep me alive at all times. And so remembering that and honoring that and just listening to the healing and wisdom of my body, finding those practices that keep me there, that's what's been helpful for me. And I think that's how we rise higher. Like, that's how I've been able to rise above any obstacles or challenges, and how I've been able to stay optimistic and hopeful and resilient and persevere throughout my life, is having those sort of practices. And the we is super important too, because there's days when I'm not feeling it, when I'm like, I'm just struggling. I'm on the struggle bus. You feel me? I need somebody to be like, yo, fam, you're on the struggle bus right now. Like, you ain't gotta be, you can get off the bus. Struggle bus only leads to the struggle destination. And I need community to remind me that I can get off the struggle bus and I can take the soul plane or take the freedom train, or I could just walk or do whatever I need to do to get off the struggle bus and join community. We need people around us who can remind us of who we are and what's possible together. And so, like, when I'm not feeling that, I need like you to hit me up, be like, yo, yo, remember?
Get
And
off
then
the bus.
right? Yeah, when you're not feeling it, I can hit you up and say, yo, remember? So yeah, we need these reminders in our lives. So
Yeah, it's as you were talking about roots going deeper,
Mhm.
community is what came to mind. And I think
Mhm.
you know, when you're talking about leaning on each other, I think part of the reason that we find ourselves in the position that we do collectively is because of how individualized society has gotten, and
Mhm.
how there has been not less of a need for community, but a less of prioritizing it. Uh,
Mhm.
I read a study that was talking about individualization based off of heating and cooling, and how the splitting of the American family started with central heating.
Oh,
Because
wow.
prior to that, everybody gathered where the warmth was, which was in the kitchen. And
Mm.
after that, they began to separate into different rooms to be alone, because there was no longer a need to stay near the source of energy. And I thought that was really interesting because of how such a small, minute thing, which I guess to say, not to say that the idea of centralized heating and cooling is like not something that drastically changed the world. But the way that it changed it is by something that is so small that it passes by as seemingly insignificant. And I think in the same way, not to say that any of the individual instances aren't significant, but I think that we are kind of remedying the problem in the same way. Whereas, like, again, not to say that any of these are insignificant, but George Floyd was not the first murdered Black man by police.
Mhm. Mhm.
And
Yeah.
so, for some reason, this one has ripple effects.
Mhm.
And I think in the same way, like somebody going to hang out in their room in prior years was
Mhm.
just a decision like any other. It's by looking at those things and saying, what do they really mean?
Mhm.
What does it mean for somebody to go hang out in the other room? What does
Yeah.
it mean for this to happen on a regular basis? A study from 2012 said we've only gone 8 days consecutively.
Mm.
That's the longest period of time between a citizen being killed by a police officer.
Wow.
And so I think in the same way that we've kind of lost the sacredness of a lot of things,
Mhm.
I think it's by realizing that sacredness again that we start to rebuild that community. And it is kind of, I would say it's probably one of my very few sources of solace in today's life, is seeing how the community that is responding to the atrocities,
Yeah.
and what it the glue that it is to bind people together again. I want to read you a quote by Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. She was interviewed recently. She was asked about possibly being president one day, and her response was, sometimes little girls will say, oh, I want you to be president, or things like that. It's very difficult for me to talk about because it provokes a lot of inner conflict, in that I never want to tell a little girl what she can't do. And I don't want to tell young people that it's not possible. I've never been in the business of doing that. But at the same time, I hold two contradictory things in mind at the same time. One is just the relentless belief that anything is possible. But at the same time, my experience here has given me a front row seat to how deeply and unconsciously, as well as consciously, so many people in this country hate women. And they hate women of color. People ask me questions about the future, and realistically, I can't even tell you if I'm going to be alive in September. And that weighs on me very heavily. And it's not just the right wing. Misogyny transcends political ideology, left, right, and center. This grip of patriarchy affects all of us, not just women, men, as I mentioned before, but also ideologically, there's an extraordinary lack of self-awareness in so many places. And so those are two very conflicting things. I admit to sometimes believing that I live in a country that would never let that happen. And I bring that up because I think that misogyny and racism are very much two heads of the same animal almost.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because anytime we talk about disparity, there seems to be like a train of caveats that make it worse. Like, we have poor people in America, but it's worse if you're a poor woman in America, and it's worse if you're a poor Black woman in America, and it's worse if you're a poor trans Black woman in America. And there's like all of these caveats that go down the line. And like she said, there is this almost unconscious nature to some of it, but there is a conscious nature to some of it. And I guess the question in all of that is, I'm sure in your life you have come face to face with both the conscious and unconscious nature of the hate that has been against you. And I'm wondering what your experiences have led you to glean in terms of how we move past that.
Yeah.
Because there's almost, it's not that I want to say we can't overcome it, but there is a very valid truth that we're not going to change everyone. And so the question is, how do we collectively move past this individually? Does that make sense?
Yeah, for sure. I appreciate that question, and I appreciate that quote too that kind of set it up. And for me, I see two paths forward. And the first is around, I mentioned earlier the significance in my life of like embodiment. And that relates to this question because, on both an individual and collective level.
Can I, not to cut in, could you just expand on embodiment for those that might not be aware of what you mean by that?
Yeah. No, I appreciate you saying that. Yeah. So, I want to make sure that what I'm saying is accessible to everyone. And so when I talk about embodiment, it's really just centering practices that center the body, the human body. And so there's things that our body does. Like I said earlier, everything our body does is to protect us, to keep us safe and keep us alive. And so I think a lot of times things that happen both consciously and consciously are coming from what our body is doing. Like if we're in danger, even if we don't like consciously realize we're in danger, our bodies might like feel unsafe and start to tighten up, and it'll go into a protective reflex, which is like fight, flight, or freeze, right? Those are some of the protective reflexes that we've learned about. A lot of people know about them, but they may not be as consciously aware that our bodies just snap into those reflexes all the time. Like all the time our bodies are going into fight, flight, or freeze, even in conversations. So this is why it's important, is like if someone has had an experience, let's just say there's a white person who had a bad experience with the Black person, and so they don't even realize it. They may never say it like outwardly that they're afraid of like big Black men or something, right? This is just an example, but it's an example that actually happens, right? And so they may actually be a really kind-hearted person who treats people of every race with respect and dignity, but then they're walking by themselves, and there's a big Black person, and like their heart starts to race faster, and there's like a tightness in their chest, and they feel like they want to just move a little bit faster, and they might even smile at the person, say, "Hey, how's it going?" But they might not even be aware of what's going on in their bodies, right? This is what I mean by like embodiment and like body-centered work, is that I'm a student and practitioner of somatic skill building. So somatic, that talks about the body. It's just like skill building in the body, paying attention to what's going on in our bodies so that we can create the spaciousness to have different responses, right? So that if that person was really doing like inner work and doing somatic skill building, they could pay attention to their bodies. And it's not about judgment either. It's not about guilt, blame, or shame, because we always come back to that grounding truth of this body is just trying to keep us alive. His body is good and worthy of love. That person's body doesn't mean they're a horrible person. It just means that their body's been trained in a way that's not helpful to them. And so how do they retrain, right? And this happens with men and women and people of all races in relationship to that hierarchy that you mentioned, right? Around gender, around sexual orientation, around race and culture. We have all these bodily responses to each other based on our lived experiences. So that seems like a lot of information, right? But all I'm trying to say is there's an importance in doing this inner work, this body-centered work, so that when we show up to create more healing and justice in the world, we're not perpetuating the same patterns that we want to disentangle, And so I think that happens at an individual level and at a communal level. And so like I try to pay attention to my body a lot, and I notice sometimes when things are happening, I'm like, whoa, there was something there that just happened. Like there was a little bit of tightness, there was a protective reflex. What's going on there? And I need to pay attention to do some work there. And then it's even more powerful when that work is done in community, right? And so, because I think what's happened is like, one, we have these responses to each other that we're not even realizing that are happening, and we're just creating more harm. But then it happens at a systemic level too, right? Where this stuff gets codified. This stuff becomes practices in our institutions, organizations, and in our governments, where it's like a law. Some laws that need to be changed. So it's the and both for me. When I said 2 paths forward, that's what I'm referring to. I'm referring to the path of like healing and mending our bodies as individuals and a collective, but then also like looking at our legislation and like what needs to be transformed there. There's some good stuff there. There's been some ground made throughout the years, but we have to admit there's still a lot of laws that need to be changed. That are still oppressive to people. And so that's where we are. That's the work I see that needs to be done. I'm grateful for like my ancestors and my elders and people who've gone on before me and like just done the hard work of creating a world where I can exist in the way that I exist, right? I'm freer and healthier than they were, but there's still a long way to go. And so that's where I come in, and that's where I invite this generation is like, how are we making this world better for those who are coming after us?
I wouldn't say it's exactly what you were talking about there, but kind of on the mental level of what you were speaking about on the physical level. Something that's helped me is remembering that we are our second thought. Our first thought is who we were trained to be.
I like that. Yeah.
And
good.
so to not hold ourselves, not to say we shouldn't be accountable for the first thought, but to not shame ourselves into this place of not changing anything positively. You know what I mean? Where we just start to go inward as like we're a horrible person or something. It allows us to continue to be a horrible person if that's what we truly are, in all honesty. And I think that is at the root of what you're talking about, is this: we need to consistently be analyzing our own experience, because it's not just what we are consciously processing in the moment. There's more to it than that.
That's just to add real briefly, that's the importance of community too, because our friends and family and other community members can recognize things about ourselves that we may not even recognize. Like we'll have unconscious behavioral patterns, and if it's said in the spirit of love, in the spirit of liberation, they can say, hey, I noticed that you said this or that you did this, and we can call each other out. And I always say we can call each other out, but also call each other in, right? Like call out those unhealthy behavior patterns. We're calling us deeper into more authenticity, call us deeper into relationship and community. And that's why it's needed both. Like, yes, I'm doing my inner work. Like I'm trying to be able to check myself so other people don't have to check me. And also I'm receptive if someone who really cares about me says, hey, like what you just said or did, you might want to work on that, And I'm intentional about saying people who care for me, because sometimes there's just jerks out there who are really harshly judgmental, and they're haters, and they always got something to say about whatever you do. You know what I mean? You got to listen to those people because you're not in a relationship with them. You're not in community with them.
Well, and there's like, I mean, there are so many situations where whatever is being said directly to you has absolutely nothing to do with you at all.
Right.
You know,
it's
you know what I
protection,
mean?
right? A lot
You're
of times
right.
it's the protection of the other person. They got their own
Right.
system you got to work on. Yeah.
They came in with a complaint, and you are just the person that gets to accept it. Like,
Customer service.
It's also, it reminds me of an interview that I watched with Sarah Paulson, actor famous for her roles on American Horror Story. But she talks about having to go through therapy because of scenes that she had done that involved her rape.
Wow.
And it was because even though she consciously knew this is all fake, her body did not.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I think that obviously that's a very peculiar situation. I don't think many people act out that kind of thing to be able to make that kind of discovery about how their body is processing things. But I bring that up just because I think that, you know, oftentimes it's the negative things that kind of push us into positive practice or fear of the negative things. And so while I wouldn't wish that kind of effect on anybody, I think that just bringing it up for people to be aware of the trauma that can happen, even when you're not conscious of it, to something that you consciously signed up for and willingly agreed to be a part of, which is not what we think of when we think of trauma. We think of it as something that was uncontrollable, that happened to us, that we were not an active participant in. But it's very much more than that. In fact, like just the very, the most basic definition is something your brain cannot process. And when we think of that, we can see how much more we were probably traumatized as children.
Right.
We're just looking at it from the basis of what was everything in my life growing up that I could not process. And so here's an interesting question that, you know, you were talking about how community is necessary for this all to change collectively, but it's very much dependent on the inner work that we all do individually. And one thing I know that we've spoken about prior or before is just the difference that you had growing up as a Black man in the United States than I did as a white person. And one of those things is that you had mentioned about being lectured on how to safely engage with law enforcement. The question that I want to pose, and this is of course coming out of, at least to my knowledge, your wife isn't pregnant or you're not expecting any children. But do you foresee yourself having that lecture with your children? And if so, does it look differently than the lecture you received? And if so, in what ways?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I do hope to have children someday. And I would hope to have them maybe in the next few years or so, but we'll see what happens with life. But what I will say is that I couldn't see myself still having to have that question, trying to have that conversation with my kids. Because I am hopeful that things will get better with law enforcement, but I don't see it getting that significantly better within the next like a
couple of years.
Yeah, 5 to 10 years, you know. So yeah, I mean, one of the reasons why I feel that way is because I just look at like I love studying history, especially like people that leaders, activists and organizers and people like Dr. King and Malcolm X, and like they were talking about the same things that we're talking about. Like Malcolm X has a whole speech about police brutality. This was going on in the 60s and 70s. Well,
and that's kind of like the root of the question too, or the reason that I ask it is because when you look at history, you're right. We've been talking about the same things forever.
Yeah.
yet life looks so differently.
Right. It's
But then-
like, oh, sorry.
then
keep
it's
going.
like, but then it's like, does it? Like when you start looking, it's
Mm-hmm.
like one of those pictures, like those memes. It's like the longer you look at it, the weirder it gets. Like I
Mm.
feel like that's
Mhm.
America. Like when you look at it, it's like, oh, that looks pretty good. That look, I don't. Wait, what?
What's going on there? Yeah, I have two thoughts that come to me in regards to that, and so one is like I ask myself, where has the significant change happened? Like, has it happened? Like when I look at to go back and reference like some of those leaders that I respect and admire, like they were able to push for like Civil Rights Act, you know, and then even before that, you know, there's desegregation and the abolishment of slavery and all these things. So like over the course of if we're just talking about United States of America, there have been things that have happened that have been significant changes that are like radically transform people's lives, right? And I think things will continue to happen like that. So that's one thought that comes to mind. We still got a lot of work to do, a lot of things that we want to see different. But the other thing that comes to mind is like, I don't want to lose my train of thought. It was about how do we change these things, right, for the future? Like I'm such a futurist. Like I love imagining future possibilities. I think that's another thing where another reason why I can be really hopeful and optimistic is because I'm like, okay, you know, there is spaciousness to like create something new, you know. And okay, so this is the second thought I had is I was just having a conversation with a friend recently about America and how like he's like, do you love America? Do you hate America? You know, is America beautiful? Is America ugly? And I'm like, it's both, you know. And I think we as human beings have to better develop the capacity to hold that complexity and nuance, because there can be arguments about, oh, America sucks or America's great. I'm like, yo, if we really had to take a holistic perspective, it's both. There's human atrocities that have occurred and continue to occur in the United States of America. We have the most people in all of human history behind bars right now, right? And a large majority of those people are there for nonviolent crimes. And they could have instead had a rehabilitative process where a community surrounds them with care and helps them with whatever they're struggling with poverty, with addiction, whatever. But instead we're like, oh, we're just gonna lock you up. That's horrendous way to try to, you know, solve those types of problems. And then there's some amazing things that are happening in the country as well. I just look at like youth are probably where I get a great source of inspiration when I work with, you know, kids and teenagers, and I'm seeing like how they're caring for the environment. They really care about like environmental justice. They really care about like honoring the identities of their friends and family members and creating new language and new ways of being that are more compassionate and more courageous. And that's happening in this country because of the freedoms that we've been afforded, right? The freedoms that we have. So I don't know. I see both, right? And that's the picture that I'm trying to paint, is that like America is both beautiful and ugly. How do we lean more into the beauty and try to cultivate more of that? That's what I ask myself, and that's what I ask the community as an artist. I care about, like, I talk about finding a metaphor for a better world, right? How do we lean into that beauty and grow more of that for ourselves and each other?
You know, I think we've definitely been seeing, I mean, you were talking about how there's definitely a political element to this. And I guess to kind of backtrack a previous statement, another source of solace in my life recently has been the activism that we are seeing in the next generation, and how mobilized and how intolerant they are of intolerance. And so the byline, or I guess not the byline, more of just like a statement of intent. Your book is Poems and Prayers for Graduates, or the people that are stepping out into the beginning of their actual life. I don't want to say into the next part of their life, because it's very much like this is where your life starts. At least as an adult, you know what I mean? Like we have our childhood and everything, but as much as we think of the freedom of living with freedom under our parents, it's not the same as living with freedom outside of our parents. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Yeah.
So I guess my question is, how do you hope your book leads people to the inner work that you were speaking about in the beginning? This obviously is a result of the inner work that has been happening within yourself. And how are you hoping to see that those seeds flourish in the future?
Yeah, so as I think about where I want the seeds of this new book to flourish, I think part of it is with the practices that I added after each poem. The subtitle is poems and practices for graduates, and even as I'm talking to folks who picking up the books, they want to give them as gifts to young people in their lives. But even I've had so many people of all ages who've like appreciated the book and said, you know what, I'm not a graduate, but this book still feels like it's helpful in this time of transition and this new phase, this new season. And then part of what they find helpful are the practices. And I was really intentional about putting practices after each poem because again, it's embodiment. It's like centered in the body. Like I don't want people to just read the poem. I want them to feel something. I want them to experience something. I want them to be participatory. And so every practice is an invitation to say, hey, you read this poem, now go do something, right? Whether it's writing some sort of reflection, journaling about, I'm like, hey, I'm giving you this a piece of my heart and my soul, but I'm also like, hey, where's your heart and where's your soul? And let's cultivate beauty and joy from our hearts and souls together. And that's what the practices are about. It's like self-care practices, but also communal care practices.
So it's very much something to do, not just something to read.
Exactly. Yeah. Something to become.
Something to become. I like that. You talk about the word that came to mind as you were talking there was immersive. And I think that people that might just be introduced to you through this interview might not know, but we're kind of heading there. This book is probably the least immersive of the things that you offer on a regular basis.
Yeah.
But I think that, in hearing how the book came about, it was kind of because of that stuff that brought it to that point. So kind of give us a little bit on what's going on with the New Renaissance.
Yeah. So for the unacquainted, the New Renaissance is my multimedia company that I started a few years ago, and we put on music concerts and theater productions, and we're working with film more recently. And so right now I'm actually developing a third theater production. So I have a 3-part saga that I've been producing here in the Twin Cities. And right before the pandemic, I did the first 2 parts of the story. So this is a soul story. It's called the Ancestor series, but the first play was called Ancestral Echoes, and there's Ancestral Origins, and then the third part of the story is called Ancestors Rising. And just to give people a little bit of background, it's a immersive theater production where, and we play around with that immersive piece too, because what we did with the theater production is we'll have like some of the actors will actually be in the audience, and the audience won't necessarily know, but they'll jump up and start dance with us from the audience.
For performance dates and ticketing information for Ancestors Rising, along with details on the New Renaissance and all Joe has coming up, visit joedavispoetry.com. And that's our show. I really do hope that you got something useful out of today's episode, whether it be applicable information or simply the inspiration to apply what you may have already known. If you did, I'd love for you to consider subscribing to our channel, and if not, as promised in the opening, feel free to not subscribe. I mean, I'm not saying that not subscribing is racist, but I'm not saying it. If you want to receive more information, motivation, and helpful information and resources between each episode, connect with us on Facebook or Instagram at iconicmedia.design. We'd love to connect with you and gain more insight to ways that we can provide the most pertinent content for you and for others like you in the future. If you'd like to share that information directly, don't forget that you can leave us a comment down below or email us directly at vip4vip@iconicmedia.design or leaving us a voicemail via the Anchor platform by Spotify at www.anchor.fm/vip4vip. As always, you can find links to all of those options along with everything referenced in today's episode and every episode in the VIP Lounge on our website at www.iconicmedia.design/vip4vip. Again, my name is Gabe Ryan. I hope that you have an iconic week. I will see you in the next episode. Same time, same place, but like for real this time. Until then, from one VIP to another, stay inspired and you'll find what you're looking for.